The needle on a compass only points to magnetic north or south, but what if you want to go in another direction? In this video, I'm going to take you to the next stage of using your compass, how to set it up so that it will guide you in any direction you choose. Later in the video, there's a practice activity you can do in your backyard, in a garden, or any large space. There's also a link to a free downloadable resource that will help you with this, and I'll give you some more information about the full online course that's available. I'm also going to use this bull to show you something you really need to know about magnetic north. I'm going to use this diagram of a map for clarity. I've marked on it my start point and my destination, and I've also marked the route that I want to follow. I want the compass to act as a guide to take me in this direction. Now, on British Ordnance Survey maps, you've got a blue grid overlaid on all of the maps, and the vertical lines of the grid point to what's called grid north, which is always was at the top of the map. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. The first thing you do is you take your compass and you're going to line up the base plate to join your start and your finish points, as if you were going to draw a line along it. Very important to make sure that this arrow here, the direction of travel arrow, is pointing in the same direction that you want to go on the map. It doesn't matter at this stage what the compass needle is actually doing. What we're going to do now is to set the bearing that we're going to walk on. The bearing is just the angle from north in a clockwise direction, which we can read off of here. Okay, so we need to adjust this to find out what the bearing is. We're going to turn the dial or the bezel around until that red arrow that you can see on the bottom of it points to grid north. To help us get that accurately, we've got these parallel lines each side at the bottom of the dial, and we can use these to help align us with the vertical grid lines. So I'll just turn that around and be as accurate as you can. And now I can take the map away, and you can see this little line in here, and that is part of the direction of travel arrow. Where that intersects the bezel is where you read the bearing off. And there it is, it's almost spot on 300. I'm using this ball that I showed you earlier as a model of the Earth. And here we've got the North Pole, which is the axis that the Earth spins around. And I've actually stuck some magnets on here to represent magnetic north. Now, as you can see, magnetic north is not in the same position as the North Pole. As well as that, magnetic north moves each year. So we need to keep this in mind when we're using a compass, because the needle in the compass points towards magnetic north, not the North Pole. For example, if I do the steps that we just did on the map earlier on and set my bearing to walk on, so I line up the base plate and I turn the dial to point to north on the map. In this case, we're looking at north being the true north or North Pole. Then if I now try and walk on that bearing, when I turn myself to line up with where the needle's pointing, you can see that it's actually pointing in that direction, and I'm off course by quite a large amount. Even a fairly small difference will make a very significant error in your journey the further that you go. So we need to add a correction factor to this. Now, either on the map itself or through other information sources, which I'll put some links to in the description, you can find out what this difference is. And then you need, if the difference is to the west, for example, here where the magnetic north lies to the west of the North Pole from where I'm looking, then you need to add to your bearing. So depending where you are in the world, if magnetic north lies to the west of true or grid north, then you turn the dial or the bezel on your compass in that direction. So for example here, if I've got a bearing of say 300, and let's say the difference is 10 degrees to the west. So magnetic north lies 10 degrees to the west of true north or grid north, I'm going to turn the dial to the left, towards the west, 10 degrees, which will give me a bearing of 310 or 310. And that's now corrected for the local declination or difference between magnetic north and true north. And I can now safely walk on that. So that instead of the arrow in the bottom of the compass and the bottom of the bezel pointing to true north, it's going to be actually pointing to magnetic north, because we know what the difference is. And because we've turned the dial around this way, that will now be accurate for us as we go along. If you're in another part of the world, you may find that for you, magnetic north lies to the east of true north, and you need to make a correction to your compass in the opposite direction. Then I turn the bezel in that direction, towards the right. So again, let's say I start with a bearing of 300, which I've taken from the map. If it's 10 degrees to the east, then I turn it 10 degrees in that direction, to the right, which means I'm taking away from 300, which gives me a bearing of 290, and that's now corrected for magnetic north being to the east of true or grid north. Now, if you're in the UK, remember I said that we have this system called Grid North on the Ordnance Survey maps. What they've done there is they've laid this grid over the map of Britain, and the north that it's aligned to lies in between true north, the North Pole, and the current position of magnetic north. This is actually a much smaller difference than the real difference between magnetic north and true north from the UK. At the moment, this makes life quite easy because it's such a small difference that in a lot of places you can, for short distances, you can almost ignore it. I think at the time of making the video, it's just under 2 degrees difference to the west. So an easy way to remember this then, there's several ways you could do this. One way that I've summarized here, see if this works for you. A good old phrase which is used a lot, west is best, which means basically you add the difference between magnetic north and true or grid north. East is least, which means you would subtract the difference. Turning the dial to the left, the bearing gets bigger. If you're turning the dial to the right, the bearing gets smaller. Before the practice activity, I've put together a course covering the foundation skills you need to navigate, orient yourself, make sense of a map, and use a compass. You can find out more about this in the link in the description below. It's free to enroll and to preview the first few lessons. You get everything in one place, there's online support available, and you get extra resources to help you. Even if you only do the free preview lessons, you'll still get some useful tips and things to get you started. And if you decide you want to invest in growing your skills and knowledge, it's easy to continue to complete the full course. Okay, in this activity, you're going to get the chance to practice setting a magnetic bearing and then walking on it. The things you're going to need are on this list that I'm showing you now, and it's also in the description. When you've got these things, get a piece of paper and mark up a diagram like the one that's on the screen now. I've put a link in the description to a free download of this diagram and a couple of other versions of it for an extension exercise later on. You're going to use this diagram to lay out the objects in the space that you've got available. You can do this indoors, or you can do it out in a backyard or a garden, which is probably better if you've got the opportunity to do that. Next thing you need to do with your diagram is to give yourself a route to do. Mark the beginning point with a triangle and your end point with a circle, and then make up a route that goes between the other points. Just give yourself arrows for directions of travel that you want to go along, and you can do this any way that you want. So I'm just doing an example here, which will give you some variety. You don't have to visit every point, it's entirely up to you. Make full use of the space you have available. Start by using the compass to find magnetic north and lay out the middle 4 objects along this line. Then put the last objects down to match the pattern on the map. Then you're ready to go. The real point of this is just to get some practice at putting your compass onto a map, with a route and just going through all the steps of setting it up so that you can walk on that bearing. In this first version, magnetic north is going to match the top of the map, so there's no correction factors to add for this at all. As you go around the course, take the time to stop at each object and reset your compass to the next bearing. That way you'll get the most out of this practice opportunity. To practice adjusting the bearing for magnetic variation, in other words, the difference between grid or true and magnetic north, you can download this version of the practice map through the link in the description, or you could just take a screenshot and copy it from that. I've moved the grid north in this version so that magnetic north is now either 15 degrees west or 10 degrees east of the grid north on this practice map. Then you have to adjust your bearing each time to get the correct magnetic bearing. Look back at the earlier section if you've forgotten anything from this. And remember, the more you practice this, then the easier this becomes. And then when you come to using this with a real map in whatever area you're going to go into, it will be much easier to get to grips with and really just to turn into something you routinely do. The reason I've gone into so much depth on this is because over the years I've seen a lot of people make quite serious navigation mistakes because they didn't really understand how to use their compass and how it worked in relation to magnetic north. I encourage you to practice using these skills because the more you do, the more familiar you'll become with the compass, and then it can be a really good, reliable friend to you when you really need it. Enjoy practicing these skills. Have a look at those links in the description. I'll see you there.